The air in Blackwood Creek, Maine always tasted of pine and rot, a sharp, icy kiss that promised deep winter, even in late September. It wasn't the kind of rot you'd find in a city alley. This was the ancient, earthy decay of things that had lived and died undisturbed for a century, all blanketed by the suffocating silence of the deep woods. For a place with a population sign proudly proclaiming 1,412 souls, it felt impossibly empty. Elias Vance drove his beat-up 2008 Ford Ranger down the single paved road, Route 17, the tires spitting gravel onto the frost-rimmed shoulders. He'd left the relentless clamor of Boston behind, chasing the ghost of a career that had been gutted by a viral newspaper clipping and a subsequent lawsuit. He was a historian, or at least he had been a respected one, until his fascination with forgotten colonial-era occult practices had bled into his peer-reviewed work a little too enthusiastically. Now, he was just Elias, renting a dusty, isolated cabin on the edge of the Blackwood State Forest to write a book he wasn't sure anyone would publish, trying to find a quiet place for the world to forget him. The cabin was exactly as the Craigslist listing had described: rustic, secluded, historical integrity, which translated to drafty, 40 minutes from the nearest store, built during the Eisenhower administration, and smells like old cigarette smoke and desperation. Elias cut the engine. The resulting silence was not peaceful. It was heavy. It pressed down on the truck, on the trees, on the very soil, the kind of silence that suggests everyone is holding their breath. He stepped out, his joints cracking from the 9-hour drive, and looked up. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray, the kind that promised snow, but delivered only a bone-chilling mist. The cabin, a dark green salt box structure, sat just 50 feet from a stagnant, oil-dark tributary that fed into the eponymous Blackwood Creek. The first oddity was the window. On the ground floor, facing the creek, the glass was opaque, not dirty, but completely covered from the inside by a dense, almost felt-like fabric, a layer of absolute, non-negotiable darkness. Privacy, he thought, shrugging it off. Maybe the last renter was a hermit. He rustled his Samsonite suitcase and a box of research notes out of the truck bed. The moment his boots touched the porch, the old wood groaned, a long, drawn-out sound like a dying animal. He found the lockbox on the railing, punched in the code, and retrieved a heavy iron key that looked more like a prop from a pirate movie. The moment he pushed the door inward, the smell hit him. Not smoke or desperation anymore, but something else. Copper and something sweet, like old flowers and spilled pennies. He flipped the light switch. Nothing. He tried another. Nothing. Great. Power outage. He dropped his bags, pulled out his phone, no signal of course, and then dug out a heavy-duty LED lantern from his box of supplies. The powerful beam sliced through the cabin's gloom. The interior was simple, a living area dominated by a massive stone fireplace, a tiny galley kitchen, and a staircase leading to a loft bedroom. The furniture was minimal: a worn leather armchair, a scarred wooden table, and a bookshelf packed with water-damaged copies of Reader's Digest condensed books. Elias moved toward the opaque window. He wanted to see the creek. He set the lantern on the table and reached for the fabric, intending to pull it down. His hand paused 6 inches from the material. It wasn't fabric, it was burlap. And it wasn't tacked up casually. It was tightly secured to the window frame with dozens of small, rusty tacks, layered 3 deep in some spots. It looked less like a curtain and more like a seal. A low, guttural noise came from the wall next to the fireplace. Elias spun around, the sudden movement causing the floorboards to protest. It wasn't a growl. It was a rhythmic, almost mechanical clunk, thump, clunk, thump. He approached the fireplace slowly, holding the lantern high. The sound was coming from inside the chimney. He shined the light up the soot-choked flue, expecting a trapped bird or maybe a raccoon. The sound stopped. He stood there for a full minute, listening to his own heart thump against the silence. Then A tiny, almost inaudible sound of something dropping hit the hearth. Elias lowered the lantern. Resting on the gray ash, a few inches from the cast-iron grate, was a small, desiccated bird's nest, and inside the nest, glistening under the lantern light, was a single, tiny, white, human molar. Not an adult tooth. A child's baby tooth, perfect and unnervingly clean. A rush of cold air, colder than the September chill outside, ghosted past his ear. Elias didn't hesitate. He snatched up the tooth, dropped it into his pocket, and backed away. His historian's instinct, the one that had ruined his career but still burned hot in his blood, kicked in. The woods, the creek, the sealed window, the tooth. These weren't random anomalies, they were context. He found the circuit breaker in the basement, a dank, mildew-smelling pit, accessible by a trapdoor in the kitchen. He flipped the main switch. The cabin's lights flickered to life upstairs, a sickly yellow illumination that did little to dispel the shadows. He hurried back up, the basement door slamming shut behind him with the sound like a gunshot. He spent the next hour unpacking his research boxes. These weren't history books. They were copies of town ledgers, microfiche images of century-old newspaper clippings, and his own meticulously organized file folders on a very specific subject: New England's unexplained dissolutions, colonial and post-colonial era disappearances. He pulled out the folder labeled Blackwood Creek, 1923. The clipping was brittle, the ink faded, but still readable. 5 souls vanish from Blackwood farmstead, local authorities stymied by impossible crime. Blackwood Creek, the entire family of Silas and Martha Weaver, along with their 3 children, aged 3, 7, and 9, have vanished from their farm just off what is now Route 17. The alarm was raised when the family's livestock was found untended for a second day. Sheriff Thorne reported no signs of struggle, no forced entry, and no footprints leading away from the property. Dinner was found partially eaten on the table. The only apparent disturbance was a small window in the children's bedroom, facing the creek, that had been methodically sealed from the inside with heavy canvas and iron tacks. The fate of the Weaver family remains unknown. Elias stood there, holding the clipping. The Weaver farmstead. Blackwood Creek. Route 17. He didn't need a street address. The cabin was on the property. He was sleeping in the footprint of a century-old atrocity. And that sealed window, the one he had tried to unseal, was almost certainly the same window referenced in the article, or one identically treated. A new realization dawned, chilling him to the core. The clipping mentioned 3 children, aged 3, 7, and 9. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the baby tooth. He held it in his palm, the tiny white piece of ivory mocking him. A baby tooth is usually lost between the ages of 6 and 12. The 3-year-old was too young. The 7-year-old was the perfect age. The clunk thump from the chimney hadn't been a warning. It had been a delivery. Elias walked slowly to the bookshelf and started pulling down the dusty paperbacks, tossing them onto the floor. Behind the last shelf, almost imperceptible against the darkened wood, he found a faint outline of a door. Not a proper door, just a seam, carefully disguised with trim. It was about the height of a small cupboard. He ran his fingers along the seam until he found a tiny, almost invisible latch. He pulled. The concealed panel swung inward, revealing a small, dark space, a recessed cavity in the stone foundation next to the fireplace. It was narrow, maybe 4 feet deep and just over a foot wide. The space wasn't large enough for an adult to hide, but it was just right for... He shined his lantern inside. The beam fell upon a small hand-stitched doll, made of straw and darkened linen. It was crude, with button eyes and yarn hair, the kind of toy a child might secretly treasure. The doll was sitting upright, facing the opening, as if patiently waiting for the light. But what caused Elias to recoil, dropping the lantern to the floor, was the doll's dress. It wasn't linen. It was a faded piece of cotton, but stitched into the fabric of the skirt were two small, dried, completely flat butterflies. Their wings were fragile, almost translucent, secured by tiny, almost invisible thread. A shudder ran through him. He knew, with a certainty that transcended history and logic, that this doll belonged to one of the Weaver children, and it had been placed here, not hidden, but placed in the small recess along with its curious decoration right after the family vanished. He retrieved the lantern, his hand shaking, and focused the light on the wall inside the cubby. The field stones were damp and slick. Engraved into the stone at eye level were marks, not letters, symbols. They were deep carvings, geometric and rough, looking like a mixture of runic script and simple charcoal sketches. A circle crossed by a line, a spiral within a triangle, and repeated over and over was a strange symbol that looked like a bird's claw gripping a short vertical stem. Elias had seen them before. They were ward symbols, crude protections used in 17th century Puritan folk magic to guard against the malicious intrusion of local spirits, or more often, to bind a specific entity to a place or object. The knowledge was like a physical blow. The Weavers hadn't simply vanished. Something happened here, and the burlap on the window, the teeth in the chimney, the symbols, and the doll, they were not remnants of an event. They were parts of a mechanism that was still active. He had to get out. The silence outside was no longer heavy. It was a hungry anticipation. He grabbed his phone again, holding it up, desperate for a sliver of signal, even one bar to call the police or even his hated editor. Nothing. Just the no-service triangle mocking him. As he turned to run for the door, a low, wet whisper came from the corner of the room near the kitchen entryway. It was too soft to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, mournful, ancient, and right there. He froze. He knew the rule of true isolation. If you hear something, it has already been watching you for a long time. He slowly turned his head. The light from his lantern and the sickly yellow bulb overhead barely reached the far corner. There was a shadow there, certainly, but this shadow seemed to move against the light, to drink it in. The whispering grew louder, resolving into a sound that was not human language, but something that scraped against the inside of his skull. A continuous, wet, hissing repetition of the number 3. 3, 3, 3. It wasn't a count. It was a single, sustained utterance, like a broken phonograph record spinning in water. Elias realized where the sound was coming from. Not the air, the wallpaper. The cheap floral-patterned wallpaper that covered the kitchen area seemed to be vibrating. He took one step back, knocking against the table. The burlap-sealed window was directly behind him. As the sound intensified, the paper began to move. Slowly at first, then rapidly, a section of the wallpaper, a 2-foot by 2-foot square, began to peel away from the wall. It didn't tear. It simply detached, folding inward on itself as if being pulled by an invisible massive suction cup. And as it peeled, revealing the bare plaster underneath, Elias saw what was scrawled on the wall, etched deeply into the plaster, with what looked like a fingernail or a shard of stone. It was the children's rhyme, the one every American kid learned, written in a shaky, erratic hand. 3 little pigs went out to play, out by the creek on a summer day. One came home, one stayed to roam, but the third was taken away. The verse was crude, the meter broken, but it was the last word that mattered. The ink used was not pencil or charcoal. It was an old, dried, reddish-brown stain that Elias recognized with a gut-wrenching certainty from his research into early colonial hygiene practices. Blood mixed with pine sap. A terrible homemade varnish meant to preserve the script. The whispers stopped. The peeled wallpaper dropped to the floor in a silent, dead heap. A new sound began. It was faint, originating from the floorboards directly beneath his feet. A scraping. He looked down. The old tongue and groove planks were covered in a century of dirt, dust, and dried sealant. But now, in the middle of the kitchen, a single line of dust was beginning to move. It wasn't a draft. Something underneath the floor was tracing a line along the gap between the boards. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The line grew longer, tracing a slow, deliberate curve. Elias stepped back again, heart hammering, trying to make sense of the geometry. The scraping stopped, and the dust settled. A few inches from his boot, etched into the grime by the unseen force below, was the symbol he had seen in the stone cupboard, the claw gripping the stem, the ward symbol. Only this time, it was drawn in reverse. Elias had studied the lore. A ward symbol is placed to keep a thing out, but if drawn in reverse or on the interior of a containment, it serves to focus the trapped entity, to empower it for a specific release or purpose. The weavers hadn't vanished. They had been used. He snatched up his lantern and his keys and sprinted for the door, driven by a primal, desperate need for the open air, the vast, empty sky, anything that wasn't the suffocating geometry of this cursed little cabin. He fumbled with the key, his hands slick with sweat. He finally got it into the lock, turned it, and a sharp, piercing scream ripped through the silence of the woods right outside the door, not 20 feet away. It wasn't a human sound. It was the desperate, metallic shriek of a vulture, not one you'd expect to find in the deep Maine woods, but the kind of scavenger that orbits a fresh kill in the arid plains. And it was screaming in absolute, unadulterated agony. A sound abruptly cut short by a wet, cracking sound. Elias yanked up the door and burst out onto the porch. He didn't look left or right, he just ran for his truck, his eyes fixed on the distant outline of the tree line. He reached the driver's side, key in hand, and threw himself inside. He jammed the key into the ignition, twisted it. The old Ranger's engine ground once, twice, a sound of sheer, miserable protest. He tried again. This time, the engine caught. It roared to life, a loud, glorious sound that was instantly comforting. He slammed the gear shift into reverse. As he turned the wheel, his headlights swept across the yard, and that's when he saw it. Near the trunk of a massive, ancient oak, just past the area where the vulture's shriek had originated, lay a pile of disturbed earth. Not a fresh grave. This was a pile of old, dark, wet soil, as if something had recently been unearthed. And sticking out of the top of the pile, caught in the stark glare of his headlights, was a foot. It was a small, desiccated foot, covered in stiff black leather that had once been a small boot. The ankle was bent at an impossible angle, the leather cracked and splitting. The foot of a child. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck fish-tailed on the gravel, then shot backward onto the narrow Route 17. He didn't slow down for the curve. He focused on getting away, on the promise of the nearest town, maybe 40 minutes away. He was 100 yards down the road, his heart finally beginning to settle from the initial terror when he made the mistake of looking into his rearview mirror. The cabin was already lost in the gloom, but just at the edge of the woods, standing perfectly still where the dirt road met the pavement, was a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, dressed in something that looked like a long, dark coat. Elias couldn't make out a face, but he didn't need to. The way it stood, rigid and unmoving, radiated an awareness that was total. It was watching the truck. Then the thing did something that snapped Elias's last thread of composure. It raised one long, spindly arm, not to wave, but to point. And it wasn't pointing at the truck, it was pointing directly at the forest floor, just a few feet from where the figure stood. Elias squinted, and then he saw it. Lying in the ditch, partially obscured by dead leaves, was a heavy, old-fashioned tin lunchbox, the kind a child might carry to school 100 years ago. The creature didn't move. It just held its position, its finger extended, pointing to the lunchbox with an unnerving, deliberate patience. Elias pressed the gas pedal harder. He told himself it was just a shadow, a reflection, a trick of the old headlights. It's a trap. It wants you to stop. He drove for another 10 minutes, glancing into the mirror every 5 seconds. The figure was gone. The road was empty. The woods pressed in on either side, dark, suffocating, and silent once more. He was finally safe. He was going to make it. Then, his eyes caught the passenger seat. The leather armchair, the burlap-sealed window, the terrifying silence of the cabin, all of it came rushing back. He had been so focused on grabbing his keys and running that he had left everything else. His suitcase, his clothes, his laptop, and all his research, the evidence, the context, the life he was trying to save, were all back in the cabin. But that wasn't what seized his attention. Lying neatly on the passenger seat, tucked right into the corner, was the little straw doll. The one he had just seen sitting in the concealed stone recess. The doll with the 2 dried butterflies stitched into its dress. It was impossible. He hadn't touched it. He hadn't brought it out of the cupboard. His hands clenched on the steering wheel, knuckles white. The doll seemed to be radiating a coldness that soaked through his clothes. Then, Elias noticed the 3rd butterfly. He leaned in, fear battling his professional fascination. Stitched right next to the 2 original faded butterflies on the doll's skirt was a 3rd one. It was smaller, less perfect than the others, and its colors, a vibrant, startling blue and yellow, were not faded at all. It was fresh. And stitched right next to the 3rd butterfly was a tiny, sharp piece of wood that looked like a needle with a single translucent thread hanging from it. The stitch was incomplete. Elias slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding violently on the pavement. He stared at the doll, the fresh butterfly, the incomplete stitch, and the lingering, awful echo of the phrase scrawled on the kitchen wall. But the 3rd was taken away. The Weavers have 3 children. 2 were gone. The 3rd, the one whose tooth he had in his pocket, had been used as the final anchor for the binding, and he, Elias Vance, had just been substituted. He was the 3rd. A deep, reverberating groan came from the back of the truck right behind his head, the sound of metal protesting under immense weight. He slowly turned in his seat. In the truck bed, sitting upright against the cab, was the tin lunchbox, the one he had seen in the ditch, pointed out by the tall, dark figure. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't gotten out. Yet the lunchbox was there. He reached back, his fingers trembling, and managed to hook the latch of the box, pulling it forward onto the seat beside him. It was heavy, too heavy for an empty lunchbox. He popped the clasp and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of damp, freshly turned soil, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth, and the pages were yellowed and warped. He flipped it open to a random page. The handwriting was neat,
childlike but precise, chronicling the daily activities of the Weaver family farm in 1923. But the final entry, dated the day the family vanished, was written in a different hand, the handwriting of an adult, scratched and frantic. It wasn't written on the page, but smeared across the facing blank sheet in what looked suspiciously like the blood and sap varnish. It doesn't want the body. It wants the context. The binding needs a story, a new story, a historian, a reader, a witness, for the third to be set free, for it to finish the collection. Elias slammed the book shut. The cabin, the teeth, the symbols, the doll, they were all a carefully arranged lure. The binding wasn't to keep a spirit in, it was to wait for a replacement to complete the collection. A new soul to take the place of the child's death that anchored the entire ritual. He threw the truck into drive and sped away, leaving the doll and the lunchbox sitting on the passenger seat. He drove for what felt like hours, until the woods finally thinned out, replaced by patchy fields, and finally, a flashing yellow light hanging over the intersection of Route 17 and a much larger state highway, civilization. He pulled into a gas station, the first sign of life he had seen, and stumbled out of the truck grabbing his phone. He had 4 bars. He immediately dialed 911, his voice a frantic, breathless mess as he tried to explain the cabin, the child's foot, the symbols, and the doll. The dispatcher was a woman with a calm, practiced voice. "Sir, you sound distressed. Can you repeat the location? Blackwood Creek, you said?" "Yes, Route 17, the old Weaver cabin. There's a child's remains, and—" He trailed off, looking back at his truck.
The passenger seat was empty. The doll and the lunchbox were gone. "And, sir, what else?" the dispatcher prompted. Elias swallowed hard. "Nothing, just the remains. Please, send someone to the Weaver property." He waited in the gas station parking lot for the police, shivering under the harsh fluorescent lights. He knew they wouldn't find the doll or the lunchbox. They might not even find the foot. An hour later, a Maine state trooper arrived, a massive man named Officer Jenkins whose uniform looked too clean for the woods. Elias gave his statement, omitting the more fantastic elements for fear of being committed. He focused on the disturbed earth and the foot. Jenkins listened patiently, taking notes. Finally, he straightened up and sighed, "Mr. Vance, I appreciate the concern, but we went out to the address you gave. There is no Weaver cabin on Route 17. The closest dwelling is a condemned logging shack 3 miles north, which has been empty since the 1960s. Elias stared at him, incredulous. "That's impossible. I rented it. I had the key. I was inside for hours." "Sir, there's nothing but dense forest and the creek at that GPS coordinate. We found no evidence of a structure, no disturbed earth, and certainly no remains." Elias reached into his pocket. "Wait, I have proof. I found this in the chimney." He pulled out the small, white human molar. Jenkins looked at the tooth, then back at Elias. He didn't take it. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come down to the station. We'll take a full report and get that addressed properly. A tooth on its own is not grounds for a major investigation. We need to talk about where you were for the last few hours." As the officer spoke, Elias looked down at the tooth in his palm. The tiny molar. The tooth of the 7-year-old Weaver child. He rotated it under the harsh gas station light. It wasn't a baby tooth anymore. It was larger, adult-sized, and it was rooted, sharp and unnervingly long. The shape had changed, elongated slightly, taking on a subtle, menacing curve. It wasn't the tooth of a 7-year-old child. It was the tooth of a vulture. The cold grip of the terror that had driven him from the cabin returned, multiplied tenfold. The scream, the sudden cracking sound, the blood mixed with pine sap on the wall. He wasn't the replacement for the child. He was the next piece of the context, the next part of the story needed to be told, to be a witness, an author of the new chapter, so the collected spirits, the weavers and others, could be finally put to rest. Elias stared past the bewildered officer, back down the dark, oppressive Route 17 toward the silent, hungry woods of Blackwood Creek. The story had not ended when he fled the cabin. The story had followed him. He knew, with a certainty that froze his blood, that the thing in the woods wasn't waiting for him to return. It was waiting for him to write. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from the sole of his boot. Elias slowly lifted his foot. Imprinted into the tread of his shoe, meticulously traced by the dust and grit of the road, was the claw gripping the stem, the reverse ward symbol. He was the focus. He was the next containment. He looked at the officer, his eyes wide and hollow. I need to write. I need to find a pen and paper. I need to finish this story. The officer reached out, concern etched on his face. Mr. Vance, let's just calm down and get you inside. Elias backed away, shaking his head. He knew the terms of the binding now. He couldn't go back, but he couldn't stop either. The story was inside him, the context that the ritual demanded. He turned and bolted, running away from the gas station, away from the officer's confused shouts, and back down the road. Not toward the cabin, but just into the night, clutching the vulture's tooth, desperate to find a place to record the truth before the ritual was complete, before the third butterfly was stitched to the doll, and his own life became the final silent period at the end of a very long, very old, and very terrible story. The silence of the Maine night welcomed him back, and from the deep, dark canopy of the Blackwood State Forest, a single, high-pitched, childlike giggle floated out on the chill air, followed by a faint, wet whispering of the number 3. Elias ran until his lungs burned and the cold air felt like shards of glass in his chest. He didn't stop to think. The instinct to flee, honed by the supernatural terror of the cabin, was all that mattered. The road signs, when he could make them out in the darkness, confirmed he was miles from Blackwood Creek, heading toward the regional center of Augusta, though it still felt impossibly far. He finally collapsed against the cold, damp wall of an abandoned roadside fruit stand, gasping for breath. The image of the Officer Jenkins, the silent, empty truck cab, and the impossibly sharp vulture's tooth in his pocket spun in his mind. He was no longer a historian chasing a cold case. He was the case itself, the newest subject of the Blackwood Creek phenomenon. The scraping sound returned, a dry, faint crack against the bottom of his boot. He didn't have to look down to know what was being etched into his shoes. The reverse ward symbol, the focus. He realized the creature's logic. It hadn't materialized the doll on the lunchbox in his truck to taunt him. It had given him the tools for the next step of the ritual. The final item needed for the binding's completion, the third butterfly's context, was the story. His historical expertise, the one thing he'd tried to use to uncover the truth, was now the very thing binding him to it. He was the witness, the chronicler, the necessary narrative anchor. He had to write, now, before the symbol on his shoe fully coalesced, before the ritual finished its slow creep. Frantically, he rummaged in his pockets. He found a promotional pen from a hotel chain and a crumpled, half-used parking ticket. It wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed space. He pushed himself away from the fruit stand and continued walking, searching for anything, a convenience store, a church, a public library. He found neither. What he found, tucked back off the main highway, was a derelict single-screen drive-in movie theater. The main marquee, rusted and half-fallen, still advertised a double feature from 1987. The projection booth, a squat concrete block, was dark, but the concession stand, a low cinder block building, had an old peeling vinyl side door that looked recently kicked in. Desperation overruled caution. Elias slipped inside. The concession stand was a mausoleum of stale popcorn and abandoned soda syrup. In the dusty, cramped back office, illuminated only by the pale light filtering through a tiny, grimy window, he found what he needed:
a legal pad, half full of stock orders from 2 decades ago, and a handful of working pens. He sank into a rickety, swivel office chair, heart pounding a relentless, frantic rhythm against his ribs. He opened the legal pad to a clean page. He didn't need to outline or research. The cabin, the silence, the cold, the terror, it was all immediate, downloaded directly into his consciousness by the entity that had stalked him out of Blackwood Creek.
Elias began to write. The Testimony of the Third. He wrote as a historian, maintaining his cold, detached voice, even as his fingers cramped and tears of fear blurred his vision. He started with the facts, the known context of the 1923 disappearance, citing the original clipping from the lunchbox, which he now realized was a historical record, not a child's toy. The Weaver family dissolution was not an abduction or a flight, but the deliberate, methodical collection of a psychic anchor. The entity, which I shall refer to as the collector, is not seeking to consume life, but to bind presence. The family was used as a matrix. He wrote about the construction of the ritual, the container. The cabin itself, built precisely over a convergence point near the stagnant creek, a well-known feature in colonial texts on terrestrial spirit trapping. The structure was a cage. The ceiling, the burlap over the window faced the water, a classic spirit thoroughfare. Sealing it with tightly tacked cloth was an act of confinement, creating a pressurized void within the home. The anchors, the 5 members of the Weaver family. The collector needed 4 anchors for the corners of the containment, the parents and the 2 children, and 1 final anchor to act as the energetic keystone for the binding, the 3-year-old, Martha Weaver, and the 9-year-old. These are the completed collections. The remaining anchor is the 3-year-old, whose death began the binding, but whose soul was too diffuse to be easily pinned. He wrote about the tooth in the chimney. The chimney, a traditional path for spirits in and out of a home, had been repurposed as a delivery chute. The collector was waiting for the final element of the binding, the replacement soul. The collector needs the ritual to be complete, to stabilize the matrix. The ritual demands a collection of 3 complete anchors. The 3-year-old's diffuse soul required an intellectual, fully aware replacement to be drawn in, witness the context, and accept the truth. A historian. I was drawn in to provide the conscious binding anchor. He wrote about his frantic escape, the vulture's tooth, the figure pointing at the lunchbox, the doll appearing in his truck with the 3rd, fresh butterfly. The 3 butterflies, 2 children collected, and the 3rd butterfly, fresh and vibrant, representing the final anchor's soul being drawn toward the idol. The collector is stitching me in. The vulture's tooth is the payment for the context, a mocking trade, a piece of the final anchor's physical body for the history he must complete. He finished the page with a shaky hand, describing the reverse ward symbol etched onto his boot, the sign of his current confinement, the focus of the ritual. He flipped the page and started on a new one. He had told the truth, but the scraping was still echoing from the bottom of his shoe. The collector was still demanding something. Elias stared at the symbols on the first page, the terrifying geometry of his narrative. He had described the why and the how, but he hadn't completed the cycle. He had told the story of the past, but he hadn't accounted for the present. He wrote, "The collector is not merely bound to the land, it is bound to the story. It requires its existence to be continually witnessed and recorded to maintain its power. The children's souls are the battery. My knowledge is the conduit. The ritual is only broken when the context is released, when the binding is shown to be a lie." He realized with a sudden devastating clarity why the police had found no cabin. The Weaver cabin wasn't a structure. It was a narrative. It was only visible to those who were part of its historical context, those who were being drawn into the ritual. When he fled, the narrative anchor, himself, was removed, and the structure vanished, leaving only a condemned shack behind for the eyes of the uninitiated. He looked around the dark, dusty office. The scraping intensified beneath him. The collector was losing patience.
Shh! Crack! The sound was sharp enough to make him cry out. He looked down. The toe of his boot was now fully illuminated by a pale blue luminescence. The reverse ward symbol was complete, burning faintly through the leather. The focus was sealed. He had minutes, maybe less. He began to write his final entry, not as a historian, but as a man fighting for his life, trying to find a loophole in the ancient, terrible rules he had just spent hours detailing. I, Elias Vance, the intended final anchor, now declare the ritual incomplete due to the collector's fundamental mistake. The binding demands a silent collection, a vanishment to maintain the narrative of fear. By forcing me to write this story, by providing the context of the ritual's workings, the doll, the tooth, the symbols, the collector has broken the silence. The collection is therefore exposed. The third anchor is unstable. He wrote his own undoing, turning the ritual's terms against the entity. To complete the binding, the story must disappear with the writer. I refuse to disappear. I refuse to be a silent collection. I am leaving this narrative, detailing the collector's method and its vulnerability, in a place it cannot follow. The collector is a creature of silence and isolation. This is now a document of witness and exposure. He knew he couldn't leave the legal pad there. The collector would simply materialize it back to the creek. He had to give the story a new, powerful anchor, a new, undeniable context. He looked up at the tiny, dusty window. Beyond it, the skeletal frame of the outdoor movie screen loomed. He scrambled up, clutching the legal pad. He jammed a stack of blank sheets into his pocket, keeping the finished pages in his hand. He kicked open the peeling side door and burst out onto the empty, grass-choked lot. The figure was there. Taller now. Thinner. An impossibly long silhouette against the dark sky. It stood motionless by the base of the massive projection screen, watching him. The whispering began again, louder this time, a cold, mournful chorus of 3 voices this time, all repeating the single, drawn-out word. Writer, writer, writer. He grabbed the nearest horizontal beam and started climbing, scrambling up the wet, cold metal like a madman. When he looked down, the collector had moved. It was right below him, at the base of the structure. It wasn't human. The dark coat was a deceptive sheath over a body that seemed to ripple and distort the air around it. Its spindly arm raised again, but this time its fingers weren't pointing. They were flexing, reaching. "You finish it!" the voices shrieked, no longer whispers, but a raw, tearing sound that echoed across the empty drive-in lot. "The context! The third must be silent!" Elias reached the small metal maintenance platform halfway up the screen. He ripped off the final, blank page of the legal pad and grabbed the pen. With the collector clawing at the metal beams just below his feet, he frantically scrawled the most important fact he had learned, the one thing that proved his resistance. I am not the third anchor. The third anchor is the story itself. The story is free. He then folded the sheet over his pen and, using the last of his strength, he jammed the pen and the final page deep into a rusted half-inch hole in the center of the massive plywood screen. He was anchoring the story, the context, not to the ground, not to the woods, but to a monument of public exposure. The moment the final page caught in the wood, a sound like a single, massive bell tolling in a deep well echoed through the drive-in. The screaming stopped. The tall, dark figure below him shuddered. Its form began to pixelate like a terrible digital glitch, collapsing inward on itself. The dark sheath peeled away, revealing not bones or flesh, but a dense, churning cloud of black butterflies and dried, crumbling pine needles. The butterflies scattered, spiraling upward and out into the night, no longer bound. Elias collapsed onto the platform, watching the sudden, violent release. The collector was gone. The whispering had stopped. The only sound was the wind rattling the metal beams and the slow, weary thud of his own heart. He looked down at his boot. The faint blue glow of the reverse ward symbol was gone. The leather was just leather again. He stayed on the platform for nearly an hour, shivering violently, waiting for something else to happen. But the night remained silent. The ritual was broken. The collected souls were released, and the collector was driven back into the isolated silence it depended on.
Elias Vance, the failed historian, had not saved a family. He had simply rewritten the ending of their story. He finally climbed down, exhausted. He retrieved the other pages of the manuscript, the full, terrible history of the Blackwood Creek binding, and tucked them securely inside his coat. He knew he couldn't publish the book. It was too strange, too true. But he would keep it. He walked back to his truck, which was still running at the gas station miles away. He never returned to academia, nor did he ever sleep in the same place for more than a few weeks. He became a chronicler of the unseen, a kind of paranormal investigative journalist who refused to publish. He traveled the American Northeast, always carrying the small leather-bound journal he'd found in the lunchbox, and the single elongated vulture's tooth he wore on a chain around his neck, the constant reminder of the price of context. He knew the cabin was gone, but the silence remained. And every time he passed a massive, isolated structure, a water tower, a broadcasting antenna, a billboard, he felt compelled to pause, reach for his notebook, and write down the full, terrifying story of the Blackwood Creek binding. Not for publication, but to ensure that the story, the context, remained free and anchored in the light, preventing the quiet, ancient evil from ever again completing its collection in the silence of the American woods.